Well, we're at it again, folks. JWC Livestream. JWC Livestream. This is Sublimated Poesy with David and Ricky. I am Ricky, and that is David down there. David, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you this evening?
I'm doing great. Creativity's been flowing like a river lately. Yeah, I did some work today, but I wrote 500 words, and for the last week, I've been writing like 1,000 words a day. So I'm stoked for that. We're working on Chiron 6. I only have I think 17,000 words of that left. I've been just chipping away. The outline is solid. It helps me get right back on the rails, and it's been easy to connect with that. And I outlined a short story. I told you about that sainthood. The audience doesn't know, but maybe I'll read it some Thursday. I'll read it when it's done. It's just the outline, but it's a very satisfying outline. The muse is bright with that one. I'm bound to have to write it sooner rather than later. I'm going to have to put things aside to get it done because she's nagging me, which is wonderful. I'm glad. I love stories projects like that come out of nowhere. It's just fantastic. There's no plot or outline for that. It just randomly comes out of nowhere. So I'm feeling great creatively. How about you, David? How's your creative side been lately?
It's going very well. I've been writing poems, and I'm working on a novel called Athenaeum, and that's going well. And I'm outlining other projects and reading quite extensively. I always highly recommend that writers read constantly.
Constantly?
Yes. It'll inspire you to write. If not, even if it's something that you're not particularly enjoying, it'll inspire you to do better than what you're reading. Sometimes there's this idea that there are bad books, and that may be true, but there are also bad readers. People who just don't really, they're just going through the motion. So I think it's important that you read very slowly and really focus on what you're reading. I've heard of this concept that reading more quickly you can absorb more information, more knowledge. You can read more books. I can assure you the number of books you read is not important. It's what happens to you while you're reading the book and how it becomes a part of your consciousness afterwards.
Yeah, definitely. And chew your words and smell your roses,
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I think a quality book, an amazing book, is consciousness altering, but it's also it's a labor of love. You read it and reread it. You read specific chapters someday. There'll be a rainy day and you'll go to your shelf and be like, I have to read the Council of Elrond today. I just have to do it. There's just something about certain passages of books that draw you. And I'm sure poems used to be the same thing for me. I would just need to read a poem every once in a while, That cabin poem you wrote, man, is out of sight. You really been stamping them out good lately,
It's a great pleasure to write them. I feel like sometimes you're writing things, and they seem good, and then what you're doing is you're gaining ground to get to a particular place where you can write maybe a small number of poems that will be worth preserving. And I'm sure this is my case, that maybe a handful of my poems will be worth saving. But those are the ones that defined who I was, or my great ambition, or my devotion, I guess my faith even. So
Yeah.
hopefully it will stand the test of time. I don't know. The pleasure of getting to write a poem is certainly the most important reward for a poet. And I was talking to you about this concept of expecting nothing and gaining everything. And I was talking to a friend on Twitter who's a very fine scholar and a teacher. And I was telling him about this concept of if I can have a cup of tea and an apple to eat and sit in a window and write a poem, I'm more than ecstatic enough. I've justified my existence. Maybe that's all a writer needs is simple pleasures that can sustain them while they discover whatever it is they're finding in their process of writing. So living simply is so vitally important to an author. And we have to isolate ourselves because I think we are solitary creatures.
Yes, without question. All the greats always said that writing is a very solitary occupation. And it's obviously the case. Most writers work best alone.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the episodic satisfaction of pursuing one's creative obsession is endlessly rewarding, at least for me. So, simplicity, lamentably, I'm a man of excess. So it's, I'm only confined by certain factors. But I don't need much, really. I have a lot of books, but there's always hunger. There's always room for more. There's always room for more fun, more parties, more creativity, more celebrations of what is published. I don't know. It's not a bacchanalian thing for me. It's more of just a taking time to savor thing, you know. But to each their own, you know. I wouldn't tell you what to do. You write great poetry. So, I mean, it would be wonderful. I'm sure there'll be more than a few that stick around, David, to be perfectly honest with you, when it comes to your poems. And even out of the greats, like who we're going to turn our attention to today, Robert Frost is one of the greats. All the people I know who treasure poetry beat their breast about Frost and exaltation, being one of the greats. My uncle is especially fond of him, and a lot of his stuff is great. But there's a few that are just undeniable. That's the key. The key is first they say, "Oh, he's marvelous. He's this." Then it's he's a genius. He or she is a genius. They are a genius. And then at last, they're undeniable, where even their critics, even the people who hate them can't deny at a certain point that they're this or they're that. I think you got a few of those in you, David, to be perfectly honest with you, and our audience out there. But today we will be reading Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening. We read a poem and we talk about it, and we read a prose piece and we talk about it, and we try to go through looking for the needle in the haystack, the wisdom, the timeless thing that will make us different writers. Only writing makes you a better writer. Well, that's not true. Reading makes you a better writer. But the point is, we can't make you a better writer. It's in the effort. It's in the love of writing. But we will make you a different writer. I promise you that. If you follow us and you listen to these things, it's going to take your mind into different directions. It has with me anyway. So again, Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening by Robert Frost. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near. Between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. Woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Now that, ladies and gentlemen, and whatever pronouns you like, that is an undeniable poem. Timeless, transcendent, resonating like crystal. I mean, think of that. Think of the journey, the narrative of him going by that house, but the imagery, you know, the house in the distance, the guy's not there, and the forest is filling with snow, and the crispy nature of the atmosphere and the precipitation. You can hear the crunch of dead grass. You can hear that crumble of snow beneath his boots as he gets up and down off of the sleigh, or on horseback, whatever it is. There's so much that's vital. There's so much opportunity there for mind theater and for us to revel in those images. It's fantastic. Now, I'm not going to make comparisons, David, but your cabin poem reminds me of this. It truly does. Like, this has what I've heard said by the Beats. This is mythic resonance, this poem. Like I said, undeniable, but mythic resonance. Like, there's such an energy, there's such a vitality to the words and the way that they flow. There's such an honesty. And this one, I think this is his most undeniable and his most famous one. It's certainly the one that was recommended to me by my uncle, one to be revered. What do you think of this poem, David?
It's one of his most famous poems. It's a very simple, direct language. There's no mystery to it, but there is mystery. The mystery is hidden behind the symbolism and behind the imagery. So I think when I look at it, I see three elements occurring here. There's the natural wonder of nature. There's the individual. There's this eternity that's outside the individual, and then there's society that's mentioned in the last stanza, where he says, "But I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep." So he has obligations to family, to society. So if you have a person that is caught between eternity and the temporal nature of life, his mortality. So it has an eternal quality to it. Anyone could be that person. The person on the horse is not Robert Frost. It's you or I. It's anyone. It's the reader. So it's there are no flaws in this poem. There's a definite reason why he's so beloved as a poet.
Without question. I mean, not even the rhyming offends me. Like, sometimes rhymes are just like, ugh, but it's like, it's perfect. It's like, they're delightful, you know? Every little thing, every little detail is delightful. There's nothing political about it. There's nothing offensive about it or aggravating. It's pure poetry, you know? Hell, man, I got to read more Frost. That's what it boils down to.
Everyone should read Frost.
You heard it here, folks. Grasp some Frost and read as soon as can be managed. Especially after that one. I mean, wow, undeniable, as I say. I enjoyed the heck out of that one, even its length. I mean, there's nothing to complain about. It's like you said. So now, as per our formula, we will move to the prose piece. Today we'll be reading Anton Chekhov. It's Misery. The twilight of evening. Big flakes of wet snow are whirling lazily about the street lamps, which have just been lighted, and lying in a thin, soft layer on roofs, horses' backs, shoulders, caps. Iona Potapov, the sledge driver, is all white like a ghost. He sits on the box without stirring, bent as double as the living body can be bent. If a regular snowdrift fell on him, it seems as though even then he would not think it necessary to shake it off. His light mare is white and motionless too. Her stillness, the angularity of her lines, and the stick-like straightness of her legs make her look like a half-penny gingerbread horse. She is probably lost in thought. Anyone who has been torn away from the plow, from the familiar gray landscapes, and cast into the slough, full of monstrous lights, of unceasing uproar and hurrying people, is bound to think. It is a long time since Iona and his nag have budged, came out of the yard before dinner time, and not a single fare yet. But now the shades of evening are falling on the town. The pale light of the street lamps changes to a vivid color, and the bustle of the street grows noisier. Sledge to Vyborgiska, Iona hears. Sledge. Iona starts, and through his snow-plastered eyelashes sees an officer in a military overcoat with a hood over his head. To Vyborskaya, repeats the officer. Are you asleep? To Vyborskaya. In token of assent, Iona gives a tug at the reins, which sends cakes of snow flying from the horse's back and shoulders. The officer gets into the sledge. The sledge driver clicks to the horse, cranes his neck like a swan, rises in his seat, and more than from habit than necessity brandishes his whip. The mare cranes her neck too, crooks her stick-like legs, and hesitatingly sets off. Where are you shoving, you devil? Iona immediately hears shouts from the dark mass, shifting to and fro before him. Where the devil are you going? Keep to the right. You don't know how to drive. Keep to the right, says the officer angrily. Coachman driving a carriage swears at him. A pedestrian crossing the road and brushing the horse's nose with his shoulder looks at him angrily and shakes the snow off of his sleeve. Iona fidgets on the box as though he were sitting on thorns, jerks his elbows, and turns his eyes about like one possessed, as though he did not know where he was or why he was there. What rascals they all are, says the officer jocosely. They are simply doing their best to run up against you or fall under the horse's feet. They must be doing it on purpose. Iona looks as his fair and moves his lips. Apparently he means to say something, but nothing comes but a sniff. What? Inquires the officer. Iona gives a wry smile and, straining his throat, brings out huskily, my son, son died this week, sir. What did he die of? Iona turns his whole body round to his fare and says, who can tell? It must have been from fever. He lay 3 weeks in the hospital and then he died. God's will. Turn round, you devil, comes out the darkness. Have you gone cracked, you old dog? Look where you're going. Drive on, says the officer. Shan't get there till tomorrow going on like this. Hurry up. The sledge driver cranes his neck again, rises in his seat, and with heavy grace swings his whip. Several times he looks round at the officer, but the latter keeps his eyes shut and is apparently disinclined to listen. Putting his fare down at Vyborgskaya, Iona stops by the restaurant and again sits huddled up on the box. Again, the wet snow paints him and his horse white. 1 hour passes, and then another. 3 young men, 2 tall and thin, 1 short and hunchbacked, come up, railing at each other and loudly stamping on the pavement with their galoshes. Cabby, to the police bridge, the hunchback cries in a cracked voice. 3 of us, 20 kopecks. Iona tugs at the reins and clicks to the horse. 20 kopecks is not a fair price, but he has no thoughts for that. Whether it is ruble, whether it is 5 kopecks does not matter to him now, so long as he has a fare. The 3 young men, shoving each other, using bad language, go up to the sledge, and all 3 try to sit down at once. The question remains to be settled. Which are to sit down and which one is to stand? After a long altercation, ill temper, and abuse, they come to the conclusion that the hunchback must stand because he is shortest. Well, drive on, says the hunchback in a cracked voice, settling himself and breathing down Iona's neck. Cut along. What a cap you've got, my friend. You wouldn't find a worse one in all Petersburg. Hee, laughs Iona. It's nothing to boast of. Well then, nothing to boast of. Drive on. Are you going to drive like this all the way, huh? Shall I give you one in the neck? My head aches, says one of the tall ones. At the Duke Mastov's yesterday, Vaska and I drank 4 bottles of brandy between us. I can't make out why you talk such stuff, says the other tall one angrily. You lie like a brute. Strike me dead, it's truth. It's about as true as that a louse coughs. Hee, grins Iona. Gentlemen. Fool, the devil take you, cries the hunchback indignantly. Will you get on, you old plague, or won't you? Is that the way to drive? Give her one with the whip. Hang it all, give it her well. Iona feels behind his back the jolting person and quivering voice of the hunchback. He hears abuse addressed to him. He sees people, and the feeling of loneliness begins, little by little, to be less heavy on his heart. The hunchback swears at him till he chokes over some elaborately whimsical string of epithets and is overpowered by his cough. His tall companions begin talking of a certain Nadisya Petrovna. Iona looks round at them, waiting till there's a brief pause. He looks round once more and says, "This week, my son died." "We shall all die," says the hunchback with a sigh, wiping his lips after coughing. "Come, drive on, my friends. I simply cannot stand crawling like this. When will he get us there?" "Well, you give him a little encouragement, one on the neck. Do you hear, you old plague? I'll make you smart. If one stands on ceremony with fellows like you, one may as well walk. Do you hear, you old dragon? Or don't you care a hang what we say?" And Iona hears rather than feels a slap on the back of his neck. He laughs. "Merry gentlemen, God give you health." "Cabman, are you married?" asks one of the tall ones. "I? Married, gentlemen. The only wife for me now is the damp earth. Oh, the grave, that is. Here's my son's dead and I'm alive. It's a strange thing. Death has come in at the wrong door. Instead of coming for me, it went for my son." Iona turns round to tell him how his son died, But at that point, the hunchback gives a faint sigh and announces, "Thank God. They have arrived at last." After taking his 20 kopecks, Iona gazes for a long while after the revelers, who disappear into a dark entry. Again, he is alone, and again there is silence for him. The misery, which has been for a brief space eased, comes back again and tears his heart more cruelly than ever. With a look of anxiety and suffering, Iona's eyes stray relentlessly among the crowds moving to and fro on both sides of the street. He cannot find among those thousands someone who will listen to him. But the crowds flit by heedless of him and his misery. His misery is immense, beyond all bounds. If Iona's heart were to burst and his misery were to flow out, it would flood the whole world, it seems. But yet it is not seen. It has found a hiding place in such an insignificant shell that one would not have found it with a candle by daylight. Iona sees a house porter with a parcel, makes up his mind to address him. "What time will it be, friend?" he asks. "Going on for 10. Why have you stopped here? Drive on." Iona drives a few paces away, bends himself double, and gives himself up to his misery. He feels it is no good to appeal to people. But before 5 minutes have passed, he draws himself up, shakes his head as though he feels a sharp pain, and tugs at the reins. He can bear it no longer. Back to the yard, he thinks, to the yard. And his little mare, as though she knew his thoughts, falls to trotting. An hour and a half later, Iona is sitting by a big dirty stove. On the stove, on the floor, and on the benches are people snoring. The air is full of smells and stuffiness. Iona looks at the sleeping figures, scratches himself, and regrets that he has come home so early. I have not earned enough to pay for the oats, even, he thinks. That's why I'm so miserable. A man who knows how to do his work, who has had enough to eat, and whose horse has had enough to eat, is always at ease. In one of the corners, a young cabman gets up, clears his throat deeply, and makes for the water bucket. "Want a drink?" Iona asks him. "Seems so." "May it do you good, but my son is dead, mate. Do you hear? This week in the hospital. It's a queer business." Iona looks to see the effect it produced by his words, but he sees nothing. The young man has covered his head over and is already asleep. The old man sighs and scratches himself. Just as the young man had been thirsty for water, he thirsts for speech. His son will soon have been dead a week, and he has not really talked to anybody. Yet he wants to talk of it properly, with deliberation. He wants to tell how his son was taken ill, how he suffered, what he said before he died, how he died. He wants to describe the funeral and how he went to the hospital to get his son's clothes. He still has his daughter, Anicia, in the country, and he wants to talk about her too. Yes, he has plenty to talk about now. His listener ought to sigh and exclaim and lament. It would be even better to talk to a woman. Though they are silly creatures, they blubber at the first word. Let's go out and have a look at the mare, Iona thinks. There's always time for sleep. You'll have sleep enough, no fear. He puts on his coat and goes into the stables where his mare is standing. He thinks about oats, about hay, about the weather. He cannot think about his son, where he is alone. To talk about him with someone is possible. To think of him and picture him is insufferable anguish. "Are you munching?" Iona asks his mare, seeing her shining eyes. "There, munch away, munch away. Since we have not earned enough for oats, we will eat hay. Yes, I have grown too old to drive. My son ought to be driving, not I. He was a real cabman. He ought to have lived. Iona is silent for a while, and then he goes on. It's how it is, old girl. Kuzma Lunich is gone. He said goodbye to me. He went and died for no reason. Now suppose you had a little colt and you were own mother to that little colt. And all at once that same little colt went and died. You'd be sorry, wouldn't you? The little mare munches, listens, and breathes on her master's hands. Iona is carried away and tells her all about it. Man, heavy duty, brutal. Very Russian. The way that it hits, man, it has a lot to tell us about certain parts of society. Like obviously, the images and stuff and the story is fantastic, but the thing it brings me back to is, when you're out somewhere and someone's doing a service for you, there's certain type of people that just brush over them and disregard their humanity. There's certain people who just talk through them like as if they were an android, like they don't have anywhere. That type of behavior, I mean, I must say I'm not fond of it. I mean, I try not to be a judgy person, but no one is this man's friend. No one, only the horse. He has no friends. It's probably because he's elderly. Maybe all of the people he knew were gone. But he has no one to confide in. There's no one that he can even grieve with. No commiseration. And he's not able to address his bereavement. There's no one that'll take him seriously. And it's a bunch of rude ignoramuses that he faces. I mean, his life feels like a disaster. It's like unbelievable. You cannot, if you're an empath in any way, you cannot have, you must have heart for this man. You must feel for him, and it's kind of like there's so much of that out there. People taken for granted, people not taken at all. It's powerful testimony to that type of situation we have here. Unforgettable. Very, very, very good. Very good choice, David. What did you think of the read, and what did you think of the story?
The read was fine. The story is one that I'm not familiar with, but it's very accessible, so it doesn't require a lot of analysis on my part, at least. You brought up earlier today when I was talking to you about tonight's selection. We were talking about this concept of winter and symbolically what it means. And I was kind of wondering if you could open that up and talk about that, because I think it might help with the analysis of the poems, the poem and the story, if you talk about this. You were mentioning something about, what was it, about getting firewood or something for a group? Maybe you could relate that story.
Certainly, yeah. Yeah, so I worked as a land surveyor for many years, and I spent a lot of winters outside. And by that I mean I would work for 6 to 8 hours out of doors, no matter how cold it was, no matter what it was doing. I mean, there's certain conditions where the instrument can't be exposed to the weather, but by and large, you will the next day or the next day. You'll be out in snow. It doesn't matter how deep or what's going on. So I've seen lots of landscapes, winter landscapes, and I've experienced a lot of wintry atmosphere. So I have an endless Rolodex of muses. One time, though, I was at a LARP, which is a live action role-playing game. I was into such things when I was in my 20s. And it was a winter LARP, which are always rough. Attendance is low, but you have to be outside a lot. The adventure's outside. So that particular weekend, it was very cold. And I was in the NPC cabin, and I had to go out and chop some wood because the space heater just wasn't cutting it. Like, we had to get the hearth going. People were bundled and everything else. So I went out, and there's just something about a winter atmosphere, you know, hearing the crunch of snow under your feet as you punch through it, the tread, the slippery tread, the sound of wind going through those barren trees. You know, occasionally snow will fly around. If it's dry enough, if, in other words, if it's cold enough, it'll fly around. If it's icy. So I felled a tree, and then I went plodding back, you know, knocked all the branches off for kindling, and we were chopping it in there, and, you know, we got the fire going. And what you're seeing there is, for the sake of our writers, for our creatives, is you're seeing the effect of cold. Nobody likes, not a lot of people like cold. I used to like cold when I was younger, because if you're cold, then you could warm up, and it's pleasant. But cold is horrifying. If you don't have the resources and the shelter, cold is death. So when you're writing a winter atmosphere, no matter how beautiful it is, no matter what kind of snow globe or Santa Claus or whatever traditional countryside you can envision, the cold is there. So, I mean, that's the thing you have to remember. You have to convey the threat of nature. Its beauty, obviously, it's like a lioness walking towards you. It's beautiful, but it's deadly, you know. And as I had said before, fire is the answer to ice. If you don't have fire, that's it. Bye bye. You have to keep your core temperature to a certain point, otherwise hypothermia. And there's always a threat of that. So those are all things that when you're writing about winter, you have to bear that in mind. You have to bear the threat. And you use that lesson and you scrub it and you transpose it on other things, like the opposite. You have to fear heights. You have to fear fire. It's not that everybody's afraid of those things. It's that if your character is, then that empathic hold will take on the reader's heart. The darker and crazier, the more the wind is howling. Oh, there's an old timer in the background that says, I haven't seen a storm like this in 50 years. And you're just like, whoa, this must be really bad. You know, all these little details. And then, oh, it's your turn to go out, Jon Snow. You know, it's like winter is, it's deadly. So the thing that I noticed about these poems, and again, this is a feather in your cap for picking these, not, you know, the poem and the prose piece, these passages, I should say. Forgive me, it's been a long day. The thing I've noticed is that they're both of a similar nature. They're both winterscapes, and they're both people traveling through winterscapes, but one, he has time to pause and observe and make merry over what he sees. He sees that house. He sees the snowy forest. He'd like to linger and smell more of the roses, but alas, he has promises. He has to go. He has to move. And then by contrast, you have this misery where the gentleman has nowhere to go. Like, no one even wants to give him his fare to do his job. Like, he's barely scraping by. So the purpose of him being out there, that is his obligation, is to make money. He has to feed his horse and himself at some point. It doesn't look like he's living in very good straits. You know, everybody's packed in like sardines. So he sounds like he's not doing well financially. But those are two different winters. The one man has some place to go. There's a hearth, there's warmth and fire, there's soul. The other man, the poor man who has recently lost his son, he has nowhere that's warm to be, that he wants to be. You know, they're all sleeping in there. And his son is in some cold grave. He even reflects on it. And he also reflects on his miserable state, the fact that he's getting too old to drive a horse anymore. He's getting too old to do it. You know, he's saying my son has to do it. I mean, what a dreadful winter that is, that he has to face. What escape is there? I mean, those are the two differences. Like, it's great to build a snowman and drink hot cocoa and come in and eat mommy's cookies. It's not so good when your son's dead and you feel doom stricken and you have not a friend in the world, and even your horse looks at you strangely because, you know, it's a horse. I mean, you're talking to a horse. So the man is in desperate straits. So these are great winters to study. One of deprivation and the other of opportunity, it seems. And what a marvelous thing that is to compare, you know, to learn. It's a world building thing for me. 2 different winters, 2 different places. Great selections though, David, great selections. Have you anything to say with regards to this great dynamic winter that we're painting?
I would say that first I would address the idea of to writers, if they want to talk about characters in any dynamic way in a story, there has to be some concept of their mortality. So this definitely touches on the Russian story. It's very, it's quite heartbreaking, the plight of this old man. And it's done in a very natural and authentic way. So it's not artificial in any way. It's just pure. It's the unimaginable that a parent loses a child.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's something that should not happen, but does happen sometimes. I would say that we're always living. Good stories always have death present in some way or other. Like the reader should be aware that this is not. This isn't an ideal world. It's characters trying to make an ideal situation in a world that isn't ideal. That's kind of how I approach it. When I was telling you about the Athenaeum novel, we had a phone call and a chat, and I pointed out that one of the characters, the main characters, is going to have to die, and we both agreed that that was necessary. Death is part of every great story. Frost has a life. He has a family. This man no longer has a family.
Yes.
There's that contrast there. And so you have 2 ends of the spectrum. I mean, you have someone who is in the thick of living the rewards of their life, and you have someone who has just lost everything. So he has nothing left. All he has is this horse. It's a very horrifying thing to think about, but it's also very meaningful too. You can draw great meaning and understanding through suffering if you're willing to open yourself up to the message. That's what I think writers should be aiming for, is a kind of more than their character. We talk about writers who I think it was George R.R. Martin was criticized for killing off so many of his characters, but he does it for a very specific reason. And people die, so it's to be expected that characters are going to die, and he's not going to apologize for killing off popular characters either. I mean, no one wants to read that this poor man's son has died. All of his fares, they were just like, don't care about it. there's that cold indifference about society. So in the end, I think for me, the message is family is everything. Your family is your community, not the community around you that your family lives in, but family, the people that you share your life with. That's all you have in the end. Other than that, you're out in the winter, you're out in the cold.
Yes. They have said in the classical times that winter is the season of death, and it is. They're treating sun, the autumn, and the bitter cold. And yeah, the threat of death is required in a story for the purposes of tension. And then when someone dies, the threat is confirmed. That means anyone can die. Even if you think they have plot armor, or you think that, there's a little bit of narrative debt, or there's something contrived, if it's done effectively, then the threat of death maintains the pace, it maintains the involvement, it drives the narrative, and it compels the reader to continue. So that's the key between these two winters, and perhaps the source of our lesson is the tension of winter, a prepared winter. That winter is fearsome and might still kill you, but a prepared winter is a winter you might survive. But this poor man who's already lost his son, that's a doom-stricken winter. That's probably one of the last winters that he'll ever have.
Most certainly, maybe 2 other winters at the most, and they will be absolute misery for him. Just
yes,
people
clearly
will wonder why he's even trying.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. If he has nothing left to his life, that his soul has been extinguished and he has no dreams left, it's very, very difficult. Hopelessness and despair. There are many, many winters that have led to that in the past. And that's an element all to itself when you paint in despair, when you're trying to write something like that. The man didn't seem to be there yet. He seemed to just be wanting a friend. It hadn't yet reached him, and who knows what it is when it will finally strike him, and he realizes he truly realizes his position. Like, he's still sorting it out, it seems. And that's the key. That's where the agony lives, is that he hasn't yet grasped it all. Like, he knows his boy is dead, but how can he know what that will mean for the rest of his life? It's still sinking in. You could feel him grasping it. He just wants help in finding it so he can get on with it, I think. He's used to practicality.
I think he's in a state of shock, wouldn't you agree?
Yes.
He's not even started to grieve yet. It's like...
That's what I mean. He needs to get to that point. Like, he wept at the funeral. He's not a monster, but he needs to get to that point of where he can cry for himself too. And once that ice breaks, there will either be fire and he will continue on until his last day, or there will be ice that covers him over and he'll have no reason to live. So that's the poetry behind a winter, that's where it lives. Who is there to shelter this man? No one, it seems. Like, he has shelter for his body, but what shelter has he for his mind, for his soul? It seems as if he has none. It seems as if the winter is covering. There's even that thing where he keeps getting snow covered, he and his horse, and it's like he doesn't care. He doesn't do anything to knock the snow off. That says something about how he's feeling.
Yes.
Yeah. Any expression of neglect, self-neglect, is a very powerful thing. And I've known a lot of people who have neglected themselves. It says a lot about self-worth and about value, and about what matters. And that's all there, like, he's not even thinking of his food. He's thinking of his poor horse. It's all in that attitude. So remember, folks, what we're trying to tell you about winter is it's a winter wonderland when you have when you have cookies and milk, and when you have a hearth, and when you have a nice Hallmark movie to watch. But when things go to hell, and you don't have anything, and there's no one to take care of you, and you're not prepared for that winter, then it's the greatest adventure you're going to have. And if you don't have fire in your heart to meet that adventure, then it's probably not going to end well. So that's how you position your character, and you build a world, and you build the character by building the world, where now we know this man and we know what he's going through. And you ask yourself, what would I do if I was faced with that? How would I deal with it? So all of your IPs and your whips can take notes, like read that. And when you want to put them in adverse conditions, when you want to challenge their spirit, that's a way to do it right there. You know, winter, threatening, being hunted by a wild animal, going to war, the danger, the tension, it's all necessary. Ramp it up, you know, don't hold back.
And risk hurting your reader in some way emotionally. Take the gamble that you're going to enrage your reader by killing off a character that they love. That it sounds like a terrible thing to do to the reader, but it's actually will enrich the reader's experience by doing so. Death ennobles humanity. It gives them a reason to make better use of their life.
Yes. Yeah, I have an old saying, weaponize the core. You know, you weaponize the heart of the reader, because you remember stories that are traumatic stories more than you remember happy stories. And it's evolution. Like, your brain wants to remember this terrible thing in case it can help you to avoid a terrible thing later. You know, it's something about how we're wired as survival machines. So, I mean, a lot of times that's what people watch horror movies for. They're looking for designer trauma. You know, people think, oh, that's ridiculous. It's not ridiculous. It's like the gospel. Like, that's why they do it. You're watching an adventure, whip cracking adventure. Someone's Indiana Jones or Luke Skywalker, whoever it is, swashbuckling and you know, the bedlam that comes with heists and scams and stuff. It's like Barrett making it out of the Death Star. All that stuff's very important. So you weaponize the core. You're not trying to like trigger people and upset people, but when they buy your book and the genre that it is, they know what they're getting into. You know, no one ever told George Martin or Stephen King to relax and to not do their thing. Best as I can see, people beg for this stuff and they want more of it, more of these terrible things, you know, because probably puts their own life in a certain perspective. But for the creative, it's mother's milk, because it's lessons in tension, which is critical. You know, it's very important. This has been a great show. Another fantastic episode that I feel like I've learned things from. These passages were great, David. I want to thank you again for picking them. Time flies when you're having fun. Now it's time for plugs. Please go to joeswritersclub.com. Go to joeswriters.club. Head to JWC, Joe Writers Club's social media. We're on a bunch of stuff. Facebook, Twitter, etc. And please do go to our Facebook channel and like and subscribe. If you like what we do, share with your friends, leave some comments. Because, I mean, I love doing this show and I'm just going to keep at it, but we want to help people with this too. Like, we're not just doing this to hear ourselves talk. I think there's, on each one of these Monday shows, we got something important that we've brought to bear, something that will inspire the writer and give them some idea of how better to word their texts and construct their narrative, you know. So by all means, do those things. I want to thank David Anderson, our resident poet, for being on the show today and for conjuring up this material. It's always a blessing what he brings to the table. Thank you, David.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And thank you also, JWC audience. Thank you for listening. Pass it on, please do share. And you guys take care. We'll see you next time, which the way these weeks go, it won't be that far away. So farewell.